Nashville, 1956. The studio lights hum with a nervous pulse, as if the room itself senses what's coming. 21-year-old Elvis Presley sits alone, shoulders tense, thumb brushing the worn edge of the guitar his mother gave him long before anyone knew his name. On the other side of the wall, a producer and a manager argue in sharp whispers about whether this young Southerner is a miracle or a disaster waiting to happen. Elvis presses a chord, low and steady, and in that instant, a memory ignites. A classroom, a skeptical stare, a sentence that cut deeper than the laughter that followed. Elvis, don't try for the stage. Your voice just isn't suited for it. He had been 15, awkward, overlooked, carrying more doubt than dreams. Yet that moment, meant to break him, became the spark that refused to die. The sound of the chord fades, and so does the present. The story pulls backward, drawing the listener into the world of a boy with nothing to offer except a trembling voice, a borrowed guitar, and a stubborn belief that maybe, somehow, he could matter. From that fragile beginning rises a journey that will shake the foundations of American music. One step, one song, one defiant heartbeat at a time. The road to Memphis felt longer than any map could measure. Their old car, coughing through every mile, was packed with cardboard boxes that sagged from humidity. A worn guitar in a frayed case, and a silence too thick for a family that had already lost more than they ever said aloud. 13-year-old Elvis sat pressed against the window, watching Mississippi fade behind him as if he were sneaking out of his own childhood. His parents tried to talk now and then, small thoughts about weather or work, but the words never settled. They all knew why they were leaving. The money was gone, opportunities even scarcer, and the house in Tupelo had begun to feel like an anchor tied to their ankles. Memphis offered nothing guaranteed, but at least it offered possible things. When they crossed into the city, Elvis felt a strange tightening in his chest. Memphis was loud, restless, unfamiliar. It moved as if each street carried its own heartbeat. Streetcars clattered by with people hanging onto rails. Shop signs flickered. The air itself seemed busier than anything back home. It was overwhelming, too much at once, but it also stirred something inside him, a sense that the world here wasn't closed. Their new home in Lauderdale Courts looked tired even at a distance, a brick building with narrow corridors and voices drifting from open windows. Children chased each other across the courtyard. Laundry lines stretched overhead like improvised flags. The smell of cooked beans, tobacco, and hot pavement hung in the air. Elvis carried his mother's suitcase and felt the familiar flush of embarrassment rise in him. This wasn't the Memphis of postcards or stories. This was where people lived when they had to, not when they chose to. But the neighbors sang at night. That was the first surprise. As the heat settled, voices lifted. Gospel harmonies, blues phrases, someone tapping rhythm on a banister. Elvis lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling while those sounds seeped through the walls. They weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw, almost aching, yet alive. He didn't know whether to feel comforted or haunted. At school, he felt smaller than ever. His clothes, hand-me-downs his mother had sewn and re-sewn, stood out for the wrong reasons. His hair, longer than what the other boys wore, drew stares. When he answered questions, his quiet voice made teachers lean forward as if trying to decide whether he was shy or strange. Neither label helped. In the halls, he moved like someone trying not to be noticed, though the fear of being noticed was exactly what trapped him. One afternoon, after a boy mocked his accent and another tugged at his shirt, Elvis walked home slower than usual, dragging his fingers along the brick walls as though feeling for something solid. He didn't tell his parents. They were already weighed down by worry. His father picked up whatever work he could, and his mother, though always gentle, seemed to shrink a little more each month. Elvis carried his guilt like a second skin. He wished he could be less of a burden, wished he could hand his parents something more than apologies. But Memphis kept revealing itself in unexpected ways. On Beale Street, where he often wandered when he could spare a dime for a soda, the air shimmered with music. Blues guitars slipped out of open doors. Pianos hammered rhythms that made people stop mid-step. Laughter and sorrow mingled as if they were made of the same fibers. One Sunday afternoon, he paused near a crowd gathered around a storefront preacher. The man's voice rolled forward in waves, half sermon and half song. He lifted verses into the air with the force of someone who believed every word could change a life. Elvis stood frozen, unsure why the sound shook something loose in him. It wasn't the melody or the message, but the way the preacher sang, as if music wasn't performance at all but confession. The notes rose rough around the edges, and yet they carried more power than anything Elvis had heard on the radio. For a moment, the noise of the city blurred, and he felt a pull he couldn't name. That night, he picked up his guitar, holding it the way some people hold a memory they don't want to lose. He played gently, careful not to wake his parents, the strings vibrating just enough to fill the small room with warmth. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even trying to improve. He played because the day had left him feeling both invisible and overwhelmed, and music was the only place where those feelings didn't crush him. Still, the doubts lingered. He knew he didn't look like the other boys. He knew he didn't sound like them either. But something had shifted the moment he heard that preacher. Something that whispered, "Maybe the very things that make you different aren't weaknesses at all." The promise was faint, but it was the first ember of belief he had ever felt. And while Memphis wasn't ready to welcome him, and he wasn't ready to step into the light, a quiet vow began forming in him, one he never said aloud. He would find a way out. He would make something of the life that seemed so small. Music wasn't a hobby anymore. It was the only doorway he could see. And though he didn't know it yet, the city that made him feel invisible was already shaping the voice the world would one day hear. By the time Elvis started at Hume's High School, he had learned the art of moving through hallways without drawing attention. He kept his books tight against his chest, walked near the walls, and waited for conversations to pass before slipping by. He wasn't unfriendly. He simply didn't know how to exist in a place where confidence seemed to come naturally to everyone except him. Hume's felt bigger, faster, and sharper than any school he had known. It wasn't unkind by design, just indifferent, which sometimes hurt even more. At home, he practiced guitar every evening, sitting cross-legged near the foot of the bed so his mother could listen while she sewed or mended clothes for neighbors. She never asked him to stop, never hinted that his playing might be a distraction. She treated his music as if it were a part of him she wanted to understand. His father, though quieter about it, would pause in the doorway now and then, nodding to say he heard something promising. Their encouragement mattered, but it didn't change how Elvis felt when he walked into school each morning, like he was carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. Late that autumn, a teacher announced that the school's music club would be taking new members. Elvis felt something stir inside him, a mixture of fear and longing. He had never sung in front of classmates. The idea alone made his stomach tighten, yet he enrolled anyway, almost without realizing he had written his own name on the list. Maybe he hoped the club would offer a place where sound mattered more than social ease. The first meeting took place in a classroom with tall windows and the faint smell of chalk dust. Students sat casually on desks, talking in groups. Elvis stayed near the door until the teacher motioned for everyone to gather. She was a practical woman with a sharp tone, the kind who valued precision over enthusiasm. She asked each student to introduce themselves and sing a few lines of any song they knew. When it was nearly his turn, Elvis felt the back of his neck burn. His hands were damp. He wondered if he should pretend to feel unwell, but before he could form an excuse, the teacher called his name. He walked forward slowly, almost apologetically. The class quieted, sensing his discomfort. He opened his mouth and released the first notes, soft, trembling, but full of color. The room didn't warm to him. Instead, he heard a chuckle, then another. It wasn't cruel laughter, just teenage amusement at someone who didn't fit the usual mold. The teacher raised her hand, stopping him mid-phrase. "That's enough," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Your voice is unusual. It won't blend well with the group." Unusual. The word echoed inside him. It carried a sting deeper than outright rejection. He nodded, stepped back, and returned to his seat, though he wished he could slip through the floorboards. When the meeting ended, he walked home without speaking to anyone, keeping his eyes fixed on the sidewalk. That night, he didn't pick up his guitar. He lay awake instead, replaying the teacher's tone, the laughter, the abrupt ending to his attempt. He felt foolish for believing he could belong in a room built for people who didn't fear the sound of their own voice. By morning, he had convinced himself that he simply wasn't meant for music beyond the privacy of his room. But discouragement doesn't always settle quietly. Sometimes it ignites something sharper. A week later, Elvis found himself standing in front of a music store, staring at the instruments displayed behind the glass. He stepped inside, drawn by the sight of sheet music and the warm scent of polished wood. The clerk, noticing his interest, showed him a few basic techniques and offered brief advice on breath control. Elvis listened carefully, hungry for any guidance. He didn't tell the man why he wanted to learn. He barely understood it himself. Yet each time he practiced afterward, he felt a steadiness return, as though the music reminded him of who he might be beneath the nervousness. When the school announced its annual talent show, Elvis read the flyer 3 times before deciding he would audition. He told no one. He didn't want encouragement. He didn't want witnesses if he failed again. He only wanted a chance to prove to himself that the teacher's verdict was not the final word. On the day of the show, backstage smelled of dust, stage lights, and teenagers' anxiety. Elvis waited in the shadows, clutching his guitar. He heard the audience murmuring on the other side of the curtain, an indistinct hum that made his heart beat hard enough to feel in his throat. One performer after another stepped forward. Tap dancers, a comedian, a girl with a bright soprano voice. Then a volunteer whispered his name. He walked under the lights, momentarily blinded by their brightness. The auditorium was full, but the faces blurred. He sat on a stool, touched the strings lightly, and began to sing. His voice didn't tremble this time. It rose warmer, richer, shaped by all the evenings spent playing to comfort himself. Something happened in the room. The audience grew still, not out of politeness, but because the sound surprised them. There was depth where they expected fragility, strength where they expected hesitation. He finished the song without knowing whether a minute or an hour had passed. When he lifted his eyes, the audience looked different. Not dazzled, but attentive in a way he had never experienced. They didn't erupt into cheers, yet he saw faces softening with curiosity, as if realizing they might have misjudged the quiet boy from Lauderdale courts. Elvis didn't win the competition. Another performer received the ribbon, but as he walked home, guitar case swinging gently at his side, He felt a calmness unlike anything he had known. The teacher's dismissal still echoed in his memory, but now it had lost its weight. He understood something the stage had revealed. His voice wasn't meant to blend. It was meant to stand apart. He didn't say this to anyone. He simply carried the revelation with him, tucked deep inside, where doubt had lived for so long. And somewhere in Memphis, a door he couldn't yet see had begun to open. The Marquis of Lewes State Theater glowed like a small constellation on South Main Street, its bulbs flickering in uneven rhythms that had nothing glamorous about them. To the patrons, it was a place of escape. Air conditioning in the summer, warm seats in the winter, and movies that made life look easier than it ever was. To Elvis, now 16, it became the first place he earned real wages, though calling them wages seemed generous. He swept floors after the crowds left, carried boxes, fetched whatever the managers needed. The work wasn't difficult, just repetitive, but he welcomed it. Every dollar meant one less burden on his parents. He would linger near the stage whenever he could, staring at the velvet curtains, imagining what it might feel like to stand in front of an audience that wasn't there to judge him, but to listen. He never voiced this thought, not to his co-workers, not to his family. Dreams, in his world, were fragile things best kept hidden from people who might accidentally crush them with well-meaning advice. Most evenings he walked home after midnight, streets quiet except for the distant hum of freight trains or a passing car. He carried his guitar slung across his back, its case frayed at the edges. When he entered the apartment, he moved silently so as not to wake his parents. Only after settling onto the edge of the bed would he lift the guitar, letting his fingers trace familiar frets. He played quietly, barely above a whisper, but even the softest notes traveled through thin walls. His mother would sometimes appear in the doorway, watching with a small, weary smile. She never interrupted. She simply listened, hands clasped against her chest, as if the music steadied her. Money remained scarce. Some weeks stretched so tight that even simple meals became a calculation. Elvis carried that pressure without complaint, but the worry seeped into him. He felt responsible in ways no teenager should. College was never a topic. Survival was. Yet he sensed that if he didn't hold on to music, something essential in him would fracture. Around this time he discovered Sun Records, not through a grand revelation, but through curiosity. The small studio on Union Avenue looked unremarkable from the outside, just another building tucked between repair shops and diners. But inside, voices were being captured, preserved, sent through radio waves that traveled farther than any of the singers had ever been. It felt like a doorway to another world, one that didn't belong to people like him, yet pulled him all the same. At first, he only watched. He lingered in the lobby under the pretense of asking questions about recording costs, though he already knew he couldn't afford a session. He listened through the walls when musicians practiced, blues players with calloused hands, country singers recounting heartbreak with unpolished sincerity. Their songs carried the grit of lived experience, not polished glamour. Elvis soaked in every sound, storing them like treasures he couldn't yet name. In the summer of 1953, after saving every spare coin from the theater job, he finally had enough to pay for a personal acetate recording. He claimed it was a gift for his mother, something sweet, simple, and plausible. But beneath that, he wanted to know whether the voice he'd been carrying inside him for years would change once it pressed into wax. The studio felt smaller than he expected, almost cramped, with warm overhead lights and equipment that hummed gently. Marion Kiesker, Sam Phillips's assistant, greeted him. She had an instinct for noticing details others missed, and something about the quiet boy with nervous hands caught her attention. When Elvis began to sing My Happiness, he didn't think about technique or audience. He thought about his mother's face when she heard it. The recording was rough, his voice occasionally unsure, but there was a texture in it that made Marion pause. After he finished, she wrote a note in her ledger. A quick observation, nothing dramatic. Young man with unusual quality. Elvis never saw it, never even suspected it existed. He left the studio not with confidence, but with a strange mix of hope and confusion. Had he done well? Was he foolish to try? He replayed the recording on a borrowed phonograph, wincing at imperfections others might not have noticed. But the deeper truth settled slowly. Hearing himself made the dream feel less distant. Not achievable, not yet, but no longer impossible. As 1953 unfolded, life became heavier. His father's work remained unstable, his mother's health fluctuated, and the constant strain in their small apartment grew louder than arguments. Elvis felt torn between duty and longing. Part of him wanted to pursue music relentlessly. Another part whispered that such a choice was selfish when his family needed him grounded, predictable, safe. Yet the late-night hours with his guitar told a different story. The rhythms he absorbed from Beale Street, the gospel phrasing he carried from church, and the country tunes stitched into his upbringing began to blend into something neither genre nor category could fully claim. It wasn't deliberate. It was instinct, a natural merging of everything he'd breathed in since childhood. This period wasn't glamorous. There were no cheering crowds, no record deals, no bright lights. There was only a teenager wrestling with expectations he couldn't meet and dreams he couldn't abandon. But it was here, in the quiet struggle, that Elvis began shaping the sound that would later change American music. It didn't feel revolutionary as he lived it. It felt like survival. And though he couldn't see ahead, the note Marion Keisker had written was already working its way toward the future. Sun Records wouldn't forget him. He had stepped into the building as a boy searching for direction. Soon, someone would call him back. The second time Elvis walked through the doors of Sun Records, he didn't carry the same shy reverence he'd had a year earlier. He still felt out of place, still moved with the hesitancy of someone afraid of being told to leave. But something inside him had settled. The acetate he'd recorded for his mother had shown him that his voice was not a trick of imagination. It existed outside him now, tangible, carved into the grooves of a disc he could hold with his own hands. He couldn't forget that. The lobby looked unchanged. Faded floor tiles, a few promotional posters curling at the edges, and the steady hum of the equipment behind the studio door. But the atmosphere felt different. Sun was gaining momentum. Blues singers, guitar pickers, and restless young musicians drifted in and out like characters passing through a shared dream. Elvis watched them with quiet admiration, wishing he had their certainty. Marion Keisker recognized him immediately. "Back for another gift?" she asked, lifting an eyebrow. Her tone was warm, but she studied him carefully. There was something in the boy's presence, a mixture of fragility and determination, that made her pay attention. "Just want to try something," he murmured. Sam Phillips wasn't in the building that afternoon. Elvis felt relieved. Phillips's reputation intimidated him. He had heard that Sam sought a very specific kind of artist, someone who could bridge gaps in the American soundscape no one else dared to cross. Elvis doubted he belonged anywhere near that vision. Still, Marion ushered him into the studio and set up a microphone. The room wasn't large, but its walls carried decades of ambition. Patched acoustic panels, scratches from stands and stools, the faint scent of warm tubes from amplifiers. Elvis stood rigidly, guitar clasped too tightly, waiting for instructions. When Marion signaled, he began to sing. It didn't go well. His voice cracked on the second phrase. His rhythm faltered. The guitar drifted out of tune. Sweat formed on his palms until he could barely hold the pick. When the song ended, he stared at the floor, embarrassed, even though Marion spoke gently to reassure him. Over the next weeks, he returned again, sometimes invited, often not. Each session left him feeling more defeated. The studio magnified every insecurity he carried. He sensed that the producers wanted something he couldn't grasp, a sound he could only approach in fleeting moments when no one was listening. He began to imagine that he had misinterpreted any early encouragement. When Sam Phillips finally heard him, his reaction was polite but restrained. "Interesting tone," he said, but nothing in his voice suggested discovery. Elvis left that day convinced it would be the last time Son would tolerate him. But fate rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as another ordinary evening. Late in July 1954, Elvis found himself in the studio again, this time with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, two musicians far more seasoned than he was. Sam Phillips hoped that pairing them might reveal something new, though nobody knew what that something should be. They attempted ballads, country tunes, slow numbers. Nothing worked. Elvis's voice seemed trapped inside him, refusing to rise. Sam grew restless. Scotty checked his watch. Bill drummed his fingers on the bass. The session was close to being abandoned when Elvis, frustrated and anxious, began fooling around during a break. He struck into "That's All Right, Mama," with a playful rhythm, kicking the tempo up without thinking. His foot tapped instinctively. His shoulders loosened. He moved as though finally remembering who he was when nobody demanded perfection. Scotty's head snapped up. Bill grinned and joined in. The room, moments earlier stagnant, came alive with electricity so raw it felt dangerous. Their sound wasn't polished or precise. It was impulsive, full of motion, the kind of energy that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Elvis didn't notice Sam stepping into the doorway until he heard his voice ring out, "Hold it. Do that again." No one breathed for a second. Elvis blinked, stunned, then began the song from the top. This time the trio hit it with confidence. The microphone caught every bit of the excitement, every unrestrained shout, every unexpected swing of rhythm. It sounded nothing like the record Son had released before. It didn't fit country, didn't match blues, didn't behave like gospel. It was a collision of influences shaped into something new by accident, or by destiny. When the take ended, the room fell silent. Even Elvis didn't understand what had just happened. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he hadn't held himself back. Sam Phillips stepped toward the control booth, his expression no longer unreadable. Something in his mind had clicked into place. Within days, Dewey Phillips, no relation, played the record on his WHBQ radio show. The effect was immediate, almost unbelievable. Phone lines lit up in a frenzy. People demanded to know who the singer was. Some thought he must be black. Others insisted he couldn't be. The confusion fed the fascination. Dewey called the Presley home that night, asking Elvis to come to the station for an interview. The boy panicked. He wasn't dressed right, he said. He wasn't ready. His mother nudged him forward, smoothing his shirt with trembling hands. When he arrived at the studio, Dewey already had the record spinning again for the fourth or fifth time. Elvis sat stiffly, clutching his knees, unsure what to say. But when the microphone was placed in front of him, something remarkable happened. His voice steadied. He spoke humbly, almost shyly, answering questions with sincerity rather than performance. Memphis listeners heard not a star, but a boy with a sound no one expected. And that authenticity only heightened the excitement. By the end of the night, Elvis Presley was no longer invisible. He walked home under a sky that felt strangely larger, as if the city itself had shifted. He had no idea that the simple act of singing during a break would ripple far beyond Memphis. He only knew that something had changed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fit in. He was being heard. The weeks after That's All Right hit Memphis radio blurred into a whirlwind Elvis could barely comprehend. One night, he was sweeping floors at the theater. The next, he was stepping onto small-town stages across the South with Scotty Moore and Bill Black beside him. They traveled in borrowed cars, gear stuffed haphazardly into trunks, their pockets never full, but their hopes newly lifted. Every mile felt like a test they weren't sure they'd pass. Most of the venues were unassuming: Legion halls, school auditoriums, makeshift platforms in county fairs. At each stop, the trio plugged into basic amplifiers that popped with static when the chords shifted. Crowds gathered not because they knew Elvis Presley, but because curiosity traveled fast in those days. Everyone had heard the rumor: a white boy who sang with the fire of black rhythm. In the segregated South, such a rumor was either blasphemy or revelation, often both. At their first shows, Elvis stood stiffly behind the microphone, gripping his guitar as if it were a shield. But when the music started, something inside him loosened. His body began to move, not rehearsed steps, not a crafted persona, just a natural response to rhythm. The audience reacted instantly. Some women screamed, startled by the rawness of it. Older men scowled. Teenagers looked at one another with wide eyes, unsure what they had witnessed but eager to feel it again. Word spread quickly, and soon the trio's schedule doubled. They crossed state lines until the names of towns blurred together: Texarkana, Shreveport, Houston, Odessa. Long hours on the road offered time for reflection, but Elvis rarely spoke about what was happening. He sat quietly in the back seat, watching the landscape roll by, wondering why people were responding so strongly to movements he didn't even realize he was making. But acclaim came with hostility. One night in Texas, before the show even began, a group of men pushed through the crowd toward the stage, shouting threats. They called his music indecent, accused him of corrupting their daughters, demanded he cut out the nonsense. The local police intervened, but the tension clung to the air like static. When Elvis stepped onto the stage, he felt the weight of dozens of hostile eyes fixed on him. Yet, when the first chords rang out, instinct overtook fear. His voice rose with a conviction he never displayed in conversation. By the end of the set, the same men who'd shouted earlier stood silent. Some begrudgingly impressed, others simply confused by their own reaction. The incident hit the newspapers the following week. The tone was half scandal, half fascination. Headlines danced between outrage and admiration, and while controversy unnerved him, Elvis couldn't deny one simple truth: each headline filled more seats. Behind the scenes, Sam Phillips worked tirelessly to book shows and secure exposure. But another figure had begun watching Elvis with a strategic eye: Tom Parker, known to many as the Colonel. Parker approached opportunities the way a chess player studies the board. Nothing was accidental. He attended shows without making himself obvious, observing not the music, but the reactions. He watched how girls surged toward the stage, how boys tried imitating Elvis's mannerisms, how adults argued afterward about what they had witnessed. Parker took note of the way Elvis handled himself: polite off stage, explosive on stage, unaware of his own magnetism. It was the kind of raw potential that made Parker's instincts sharpen. He didn't rush in. He preferred to wait until circumstances aligned, until the young singer needed someone who could navigate the national market. Tension grew at Sun Records. Elvis's popularity was escalating faster than the small studio could support. Tour demands increased, distribution struggled, and Sam Phillips knew that holding on to Elvis might eventually hold him back. The choice before him was difficult. Sun had given Elvis a beginning, but RCA had the power to give him a future. Meanwhile, the trio's performances reached new intensity. Elvis had begun experimenting with movements not to shock, but to match the energy inside him. His knees bent with rhythm, hips shifting in patterns audiences had never seen from a Southern boy singing country-influenced music. The more he tried to control it, the more it flowed through him. And the more he surrendered to it, the louder the reaction grew. After one show in Louisiana, a reporter scribbled notes furiously while fans pounded on the windows outside. "What do you call what you do?" he asked Elvis as they waited to exit through the back door. Elvis shrugged, pulling his jacket tighter. "Just singing," he muttered. But the reporter shook his head. "No, son, something's changing." He was right. Something was changing. Though Elvis didn't understand its scope, he felt overwhelmed, grateful, confused, and responsible all at once. Fame wasn't the thrill others imagined. It was a widening spotlight that left fewer places to hide. Yet the moments on stage balanced the chaos. When he strummed the opening chords and the audience lunged toward the edge of their seats, he felt connected to something larger than himself, a force that pulsed through the music, through their collective breath, through the rising heat in the room. It wasn't arrogance, it was awakening. By late 1955, the Colonel stepped from the shadows. Opportunities were multiplying, bigger labels calling, and Elvis stood at a crossroads he didn't yet recognize. Sun Records had taken him as far as it could. The world beyond was knocking, and the knock was growing louder. What Elvis did understand was simpler. The stage no longer frightened him. It challenged him. It demanded honesty. And each night he walked away drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the roar of the crowd echoing in his ears long after midnight. He didn't know it yet, but the early tremors of cultural upheaval had begun. The South was shifting. America was listening. And the quiet boy from Lauderdale Courts was becoming the dividing line between what music had been and what it was about to become. By the end of 1955, Elvis stood at the edge of a transformation he could sense, but not yet comprehend. Sun Records had become too small to contain what was happening around him. Audiences swelling, reporters circling, radio stations playing his records with increasing frequency. Sam Phillips, who had believed in him before anyone else did, faced a difficult truth. To let Elvis grow, he had to let him go. When RCA expressed interest, the terms stunned the industry. $35,000 for a young man who, only a year earlier, had been sweeping theater aisles. The sum felt unreal, almost detached from the life Elvis knew. His parents were overwhelmed, unsure how to interpret something so monumental. His father held the contract with trembling hands, and his mother cried softly, as if afraid the opportunity might vanish if she blinked. Elvis signed with a mix of gratitude and fear. The RCA logo represented the kind of machinery he had never imagined being part of. Large studios, national distribution, expectations that carried more weight than applause. He didn't feel ready, but readiness no longer mattered. The tide was moving, and he was caught in its pull. The first RCA studio session took place in Nashville. The building felt intimidating, Spotless floors, engineers in crisp shirts, equipment that looked less like instruments of creativity and more like instruments of measurement. Unlike the warm chaos of Sun, where improvisation was welcome, RCA operated with the precision of a laboratory. Elvis felt the stiffness in the air the moment he walked in. He tried to settle himself, but nerves crept into his voice. The engineers observed him through the glass, their expressions unreadable. The silence between takes pressed down heavily. For a brief moment, he wondered if the label had made a mistake, if the rawness that had drawn listeners to him on small southern stages would be lost under the weight of corporate expectations. Then came Heartbreak Hotel. The song had been inspired by a real tragedy, a man who died by suicide, leaving behind a note that read, like a whisper of hopelessness, "I walk a lonely street." The story unsettled Elvis deeply. He carried loneliness with him, wrapped in memories of hardship, insecurity, and the quiet knowledge that success didn't erase old wounds. When he sang, he channeled all of it, not with theatrics, but with a solemn intensity that felt almost private. During the recording, the room seemed to shift. His voice hit a register not just low in tone, but low in meaning, something hollow and vast, like the echo inside an empty building. The musicians followed his lead instinctively, shaping the sound around him. When the final note faded, no one spoke for several seconds. RCA had its hit. But Elvis didn't celebrate. He walked outside alone, breathing in the cool night air, trying to understand why singing the song had felt more like confession than performance. Fame, once distant, was now pressing close. Applause grew louder, but so did the sense that every step forward carried a new obligation. Television appearances soon followed. The Dorsey Brothers' stage show was his entry point into national visibility. The studio lights burned hot. The cameras tracked his movements with the scrutiny of an unblinking audience. His first appearance wasn't explosive. It was tentative, testing the waters of a new world. But by the second and third performances, Elvis began to unlock the freedom he'd felt on Southern stages. His voice held confidence. His body moved with ease. Viewers felt that something new had arrived. Not a polished entertainer, but a force of nature they couldn't categorize. Letters poured in. Newspaper columns debated him. Preachers condemned him. Teenagers adored him. The push and pull of admiration and outrage became the soundtrack of his rising fame. Each appearance intensified the polarization. Elvis found himself walking through airports flanked by crowds, reporters calling his name with flashes that left him blinking spots from his vision. The Colonel tightened control, navigating contracts, bookings, and publicity with the efficiency of a military strategist. He shielded Elvis from certain pressures while steering him into others. Opportunities multiplied. More shows, more recordings, larger venues. Elvis barely had time to slow down, let alone question the pace. Yet beneath the momentum, an undercurrent of doubt lingered. He missed the intimacy of Sun Records, the warmth of Sam Phillips's guidance, the safety of small rooms where mistakes were part of the process. RCA expected consistency, not vulnerability. And the larger the stage became, the less room he felt he had for uncertainty. Still, the world responded. Teenagers stood outside hotels by the hundreds. Mothers scolded their daughters for swooning over him. Fathers worried the country was changing too quickly. Elvis absorbed all of it quietly. He never believed he was leading a movement. He simply followed what felt natural inside him. But natural instincts become cultural earthquakes when amplified through national airwaves. By early 1956, Heartbreak Hotel soared to the top of the charts. The song that had frightened him with its darkness became the anthem that carried his name across the country. He traveled endlessly, slept seldom, and learned to exist in a world where strangers felt entitled to pieces of him. And though success poured in faster than he could absorb, he still returned home between tours, sitting at the kitchen table with his parents, eating the same simple meals, grounding himself in familiarity. The outside world saw an icon emerging. At home, he remained the boy who never wanted to disappoint his mother. He didn't yet grasp the scale of what was beginning. He only felt the momentum, unstoppable, thrilling, and terrifying. A leap into fame, with no map for the way down. Elvis had just begun to understand the strange geography of fame when the government letter arrived. It lay on the kitchen table like a verdict, plain envelope, official seal, no emotion behind the words inside. You are hereby ordered to report for military service. He read the notice twice, then a third time, letting the meaning sink into a life that had barely stabilized under the weight of success. Fans protested, newspapers speculated, and television commentators debated whether the Army should make an exception for him. But Elvis dismissed the notion before it could take root. "I'll go like any other man," he insisted, his voice steady, even while the rest of him felt unsteady. He knew what it would look like if he sought special treatment. That fame had made him soft, detached from the world he came from. He couldn't stomach that idea, not after everything his parents had sacrificed. The day he reported, the cameras swarmed like a migrating flock. Flashbulbs erupted in bursts. Reporters leaned over each other shouting his name, hoping for a final quote. Elvis smiled politely, but beneath the calm exterior, he felt a knot tightening in his chest. When the wai, Barber's electric clippers buzzed to life, the sound echoed strangely inside him. As the first locks fell, he felt as if a chapter of his identity was being removed strand by strand. He didn't flinch, but the sensation left him hollow. Basic training stripped life down to its simplest form. Early mornings, ordered beds, shouted commands, and the rigid sameness of every day. The men in his unit weren't sure how to treat him at first. Some kept their distance, wary of the celebrity in their ranks. Others watched him closely, trying to catch him slipping. But Elvis worked hard, followed orders, and refused privileges. Gradually, suspicion softened. He ate in the same mess hall, scrubbed the same floors, marched in the same formations. The Army didn't care about record sales. Neither did the drill sergeants. And, oddly enough, that anonymity, rough as it was, became its own kind of relief. Then came the phone call. He was in the barracks when a sergeant approached with an expression that carried too much gravity to ignore. "Private Presley," he said quietly. "There's news from home." His mother, Gladys, had fallen ill. The details were unclear, but Elvis didn't need details. He felt the truth in his bones. Permission for emergency leave came quickly. He boarded a flight, then another, moving through terminals in a daze. When he reached the hospital in Memphis, his mother lay small against the white sheets, her breathing shallow, her skin cool beneath his trembling hands. Gladys had been the center of his world, the anchor that steadied him through years of insecurity, poverty, and unexpected fame. Her voice had been his first encouragement, her pride, his first belonging. And now she was slipping away, unreachable even as he whispered her name. She passed on August 14, 1958. The grief that followed was not the public mourning the world saw in photographs. It was quiet devastation, the kind that compresses the heart until breathing becomes a conscious effort. Elvis stayed alone with her body for hours, the staff giving him space they knew he needed. He stroked her hair, whispered memories, tried to bargain with realities that would not bend. When he finally stepped out of the room, he carried a weight that would never fully lift again. Returning to military service felt like stepping into a world drained of color. The order, the routine, the discipline, none of it dulled the ache. If anything, the uniform made the grief sharper, as though he had stepped back into duty while a part of him remained in Memphis, unwilling to leave her. His transfer to Germany introduced a different tempo of life. Cold air, orderly streets, the distant hum of military life reshaped by post-war tension. Off-duty hours offered little comfort. He read letters from home until the pages softened from handling. He tried focusing on training, but concentration fractured easily. It was during this period of emotional disorientation that he met Priscilla Beaulieu. She was young, far younger than anyone he might have become close to under ordinary circumstances. But what drew him to her wasn't romance or glamour. It was quiet. She listened without pressing, existed without demanding, and carried an innocence that reminded him of calmer days before fame and heartbreak. When he spoke with her, the heaviness inside him lightened slightly, as though grief could be diluted by simple companionship. The officers noted his politeness, his reliability. He never flaunted who he was. He never asked for special treatment. The soldiers treated him less like a star and more like a man trying to hold himself together. And sometimes, late at night, when the barracks were still, Elvis sat on his bunk and strummed his guitar with muted strings, holding on to music like a lifeline. He didn't sing loudly. He didn't dare. But every faint vibration reminded him that pieces of himself still lived beneath the sorrow. The army shaped him, but not in the way headlines suggested. It didn't discipline him into adulthood. It pushed him into a confrontation with loss he wasn't prepared for. It taught him how fragile stability could be, and how quickly life could bend without breaking. When his service neared its end, the world waited eagerly for the musical titan to return. But the man preparing to leave Germany was not the one who had arrived. He was quieter, more solemn, carrying the imprint of the greatest wound of his life. He would go home, but he would not be the same. When Elvis returned to America in March 1960, crowds flooded the airport as though welcoming home a wartime hero. Camera crews rushed forward, lights flashing, and reporters shouted questions he barely heard. He smiled out of instinct, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He had left for Germany as a rising star. He came back with the weight of loss still clinging to him like a shadow. The world saw triumph. He felt something closer to displacement. He tried to resume life as it had been, but nothing fit the way it once did. Music had marched on during his absence. Young bands from England were reshaping the cultural landscape, pushing boundaries he had once been credited with opening. The Beatles, the Stones, names that now generated the kind of frenzy he once sparked. Elvis felt admiration for them, even envy, but also a sharp pang of uncertainty. Had the world moved past him? The Colonel had no interest in uncertainty. Almost immediately, he presented Elvis with a new blueprint: Hollywood films, steady paychecks, slick soundtracks, clean publicity. It was a plan built not on artistry, but on control. Movies offered stability, predictability, profit, and, for Parker, predictability was king. The first few films felt exciting in their novelty. Elvis enjoyed the camaraderie on set, the warmth of the cast and crew, the sense of being part of something larger than himself. But as the years progressed, the stories grew thinner, the scripts more formulaic. Beaches, fast cars, rooftop songs, interchangeable leading ladies. The pattern repeated itself until even Elvis struggled to distinguish one film from another. Recording sessions for these movies often left him numb. The music had been chosen for its marketability, not its soul. He stood before the microphone singing pleasant but forgettable melodies, watching producers nod in approval of material that stirred nothing in him. When he left the studio on those days, he felt as though he were leaving pieces of himself behind, leaving them to dissolve among the tape reels. His home life grew increasingly isolated. Graceland, once a beacon of pride for his parents, now became a retreat, a fortress against the outside world's expectations. Staff members moved quietly through the halls. Friends came and went at late hours. Long nights blurred into each other under dim lights and heavy curtains. Inside those walls, Elvis drifted, tethered only by habit and the music he played in private moments. He spent nights sitting at the piano in his living room, letting his fingers find gospel chords that had anchored him since childhood. The sound filled the empty spaces, echoing off the walls with a warmth none of his film soundtracks possessed. Those quiet, late-night sessions often ended with Elvis staring at the piano keys long after the last note faded, wondering when his life had begun to feel so crowded, yet so empty. Popularity didn't disappear. Audiences still adored him, but admiration without connection left him cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was performing a version of himself, crafted by others, not the young man who once sang freely in cramped studios on Union Avenue. The mid-1960s intensified the divide. Counterculture movements swept the country, demanding authenticity, protest, rebellion. Elvis, who had once embodied youthful daring, now seemed out of sync with the times. Critics dismissed his films as relics of a fading era. His record sales dipped, and beneath the public surface he felt something eroding, the instinctual joy that had once surged through him whenever he touched a guitar. The pressure mounted. The Colonel insisted he stay the course. More films, more soundtracks, more controlled visibility. Elvis complied, but each project chipped away at his confidence. He no longer trusted his own instincts. He felt himself dissolving into the very image that had once made him famous. Loneliness seeped in through the cracks. The demands of fame kept him surrounded by people, yet deprived him of genuine connection. Those who cared for him struggled to reach him. Those who didn't care for him knew how to profit from the distance he kept. Nights grew longer, sleep more elusive. He began relying on small pills prescribed by doctors who believed they were doing him a kindness, something to help him rest, to help him endure. They never intended harm, but the habit formed quietly, almost invisibly. In the midst of this fog, small glimmers of clarity appeared. Occasionally, he recorded songs outside the film contracts, songs with grit, with depth, with the old spark. In those moments, his voice sounded alive again, textured with the hunger of earlier years. But the opportunities came rarely, swallowed by obligations he didn't know how to break. By 1967, tension reached its peak. Elvis looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. Fame had placed a crown on his head, but every year showed him more clearly how heavy that crown could be. He felt trapped by contracts, by expectations, by the ghost of the career he once imagined. Then, almost unexpectedly, NBC reached out with a proposal, a televised special for the 1968 holiday season. Parker intended it to be a pleasant variety show with festive songs and safe dialogue. But the producers had another idea, something bolder, something truer. They wanted Elvis to reclaim himself. He didn't know yet that this invitation would become the turning point he had been waiting for, the spark buried beneath years of repetition and restraint. He only sensed that a door, long sealed, might finally be opening. And for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of anticipation rather than dread. The rehearsal room for the NBC special felt strangely intimate. Dark curtains, low lighting, and a circular stage that forced every performer to confront the audience directly. Elvis stepped inside with uncertainty, shadowing his confidence. He hadn't stood on a real concert stage in years. Movie sets didn't count. They demanded performance, not presence. Here, under the raw brightness of rehearsal lamps, he felt the long-buried flutter of something he once knew well: fear. The black leather suit they prepared for him looked bold, almost defiant, but putting it on made his pulse quicken. Would the world accept him again? Or had the years of formulaic films erased their memory of the young firebrand who once startled the nation? He sat quietly before the first taping, elbows resting on his knees, head lowered. No one approached him. They sensed he needed solitude. Then the band struck the first chords. Elvis stepped onto the small platform, surrounded by musicians seated close enough to feel each vibration from the guitar strings. He opened his mouth and let out a note that didn't sound cautious or timid. It sounded alive. The years of restraint broke open in an instant. The audience in the studio gasped, then erupted in applause. He fed off their energy, and they fed off his. Laughter bubbled out of him between songs, real laughter, not the polished smiles he used in film publicity. Sweat ran down his temples as he joked with the band, tapped his foot, let himself move with the rhythm as naturally as breathing. During one of the breaks, a producer whispered, "We're witnessing something historic." And they were. America had tuned in expecting nostalgia, but what they saw was rebirth. When the special aired in December 1968, millions watched in stunned silence before cheering at their screens. The image of Elvis in black leather, gripping the microphone with raw intensity, cut through an era dominated by psychedelic rock and cultural upheaval. He wasn't trying to compete with the new generation. He was reminding them who had first ripped open the seams of American music. The nation felt it. So did Elvis. For the first time in years, he recognized the man on the screen. The success of the special opened doors that had been closed for too long. Offers surged. Live shows, tours, television appearances. But one opportunity glowed brighter than the rest: Las Vegas. Vegas' neon landscape felt like another universe. Casinos pulsed with energy at all hours, and velvet-draped theaters promised glamour tinged with danger. Elvis stepped into the International Hotel's main showroom for his first rehearsal and felt the room stretch around him. Vast stage, towering lights, a full orchestra ready to follow his lead. It wasn't the scrappy trio of his early days. This was a production of magnitude. He demanded excellence from himself. Rehearsals went late into the night, sometimes until dawn. He worked the band hard, refining arrangements, experimenting with crescendos, pushing vocals that challenged his breath and endurance. His energy, once stifled by movie scripts, burst forth with renewed urgency. Opening night in 1969 arrived like a wave crashing onto shore. The crowd filled the room beyond capacity. Celebrities, journalists, fans who had waited more than a decade to see him return to real performing. When the orchestra swelled and Elvis walked out in a white jumpsuit glittering under the stage lights, a roar rose so loud it felt physical. He sang with a ferocity that astonished even those who had followed him from the beginning. The high notes soared. The low notes vibrated through the floor. Movements came naturally, fluid, unrestrained. He commanded the stage not through choreography, but through presence. Magnetic, urgent, utterly himself. People who had doubted him left the theater in disbelief. Critics who expected a stale revival wrote reviews filled with reluctant admiration. Night after night, the show sold out, eventually becoming the blueprint for what modern Las Vegas residencies would be. But triumph didn't erase the pressure. If anything, it intensified it. The demands were constant. More shows, more recordings, more expectations. The Colonel engineered opportunities faster than Elvis could fully process them. His schedule swelled with obligations, and though the performances remained electrifying, the hours between them grew heavier. Late nights in hotel suites filled with noise, people drifting in and out, doctors prescribing pills to help him stay awake, others to help him sleep, something else to help him calm down. The line between assistance and dependency blurred quietly. Still, the music carried him, and nowhere did it carry him farther than Hawaii. The concept for Aloha from Hawaii sounded almost impossible. A concert broadcast live via satellite to dozens of countries, a global audience unprecedented in music history. Elvis trained rigorously for it, treating the event not as routine, but as a personal vow. His body felt the strain, but his determination overpowered the fatigue. He understood what this moment represented. It was not a comeback. It was a declaration. On the night of the broadcast in January 1973, the arena swelled with anticipation. As the countdown began, Elvis stood backstage, breathing slowly, eyes closed. The weight of the last 20 years, poverty, ridicule, discovery, reinvention, loss, pressed into his chest. And yet, beneath it all, there was a spark that refused to dim. When he stepped onto the stage, wearing the white American Eagle jumpsuit, the room erupted. He began with steady control, letting the music build around him. But as the set progressed, something deeper surfaced. His voice carried not just power, but truth. Weathered, wounded, unwavering. Songs that had once been simple performances now felt like confessions offered to the world. The final number, "I Can't Help Falling in Love," unfolded slowly, reverently. And as he bowed, sweat shining on his brow, time seemed to still. Millions watched across continents. Millions felt the same sensation. A man giving everything he had left, holding nothing back. This wasn't decline. This was transcendence. A moment carved into global memory, the pinnacle of a life lived between brilliance and burden. And when the lights dimmed and the applause softened, Elvis walked off stage knowing something essential. All the people who had doubted him, teachers, critics, industry gatekeepers, had been wrong. The boy who once hid in the shadows of Lauderdale courts had not only risen above circumstance, he had risen above the world's expectations. His story was not defined by its ending. It was defined by the heights he reached despite every force that tried to hold him down.